Raiders were closing on her, and what Wade Carver did next changed everything: his land, his life, and the long silence he had carried since the day his wife died. That was the Arizona Territory, summer 1884. Sulphur Springs Valley, east of the Dragoon Mountains, where the heat sat heavy and still in the afternoon, and the dust rose off the flats in long, lazy curtains, and a man could go 3 days without seeing another human face and call that ordinary. Wade Carver called it ordinary. He had been calling it ordinary for 2 years. He was 32 years old, not tall, but built solid and lean the way men get when their work is physical and their meals are simple. He had dark hair going a little long at the collar, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor since Tuesday, and eyes the color of creek water in November, clear and quiet and a little bit far away. People who knew Wade, and there weren't many, said the quiet in his eyes was the grief. His wife Clara had died of fever the winter before last. A fast fever, the kind that comes in the night and doesn't leave time for anything but sitting beside the bed and holding a hand. She was 28. She had been healthy all her life, right up until she wasn't. After Clara, Wade put himself into the ranch the way a man puts himself into work, when work is the only thing that keeps him from thinking. His spread sat on a wide piece of ground between 2 dry creeks in the eastern reaches of the Sulphur Springs Valley. 80 acres of usable pasture, a decent well, a barn that needed a new roof on the north side. He kept a small herd of cattle and 2 working horses, a big gray named Solomon that he used for fence and cattle work, and a fast chestnut quarter horse he called Rudy that he'd bought from a trader 3 years back. Rudy was the best horse he'd ever owned, quick and steady and smart enough to anticipate what you needed before you asked for it. Clara had loved that horse. Wade also had one ranch hand, a dry, quiet man named Burl who had been with him 4 years and who communicated mostly through nods and the occasional strategic silence. Burl was good with cattle and good with fences, and he never asked questions that weren't strictly necessary. Wade appreciated all 3 qualities in roughly equal measure. That was his life: the ranch, the cattle, the 2 horses, Burl, and the long quiet of the valley. He had made his peace with it. He told himself that on most mornings it was almost true. The morning he saw Nita was a Thursday in late July. He had ridden Rudy out to check the eastern fence line, which ran along the base of a low ridgeback about 2 miles from the ranch house. It was early still, the light coming in low and amber from the east, and the heat hadn't built yet. He was moving along the fence at a walk, leaning from the saddle to check the wire when he heard it. Hoofbeats, hard and fast, more than 1 horse. He straightened and looked east. The trail that cut along the base of the ridge was visible from where he sat, maybe a 1/4 mile off, and what he saw on it stopped him. A woman, running on foot, moving fast along the trail's edge, staying close to the rocky outcroppings where the juniper grew dense enough to offer cover. She was Apache. He could see that from her dress, a finely made garment of tanned hide with beadwork at the hem, and her moccasins, and the way she moved, economical and precise and utterly without panic, even though she was clearly running for her life. Behind her, maybe half a mile back, 3 riders coming at a hard canter. Wade sat for a moment with his hand on the saddle horn and took in the situation. The riders were white men. He could see that from the cut of their clothes, even at this distance. They were riding hard, and they weren't calling out the way you'd call out if you were trying to help someone. They were riding the way you ride when you're running something down. The woman reached the section of trail that ran past his fence line, and she slowed slightly, reading the terrain ahead of her. And that was when she saw Wade. She stopped. For a moment they just looked at each other. She was maybe 50 yards off, young, early 20s, and strikingly beautiful in the way that stops thought. High cheekbones, dark eyes with a kind of intelligence in them that registered everything and gave nothing away, her black hair loose and slightly wild from running. She was holding a wrapped bundle pressed tight against her ribs. She was breathing hard. She didn't ask for help. She just stood there and looked at him with those level dark eyes, and he could see her calculating whether he was another threat, whether the riders behind her were likely to get instructions from him, whether standing still was a better option than running. Wade looked back at the riders. They were closing fast. He looked at Rudy under him, at the chestnut's quick feet and long stride, and then he made a decision that he didn't fully think through before he made it. He swung down from the saddle. He walked Rudy toward her, holding the reins in one hand, and he stopped about 10 feet away and held the reins out. She looked at the horse. She looked at him. She looked back at the riders behind her, now maybe a quarter mile and coming hard. Then she took the reins. She didn't say anything. She mounted in one smooth motion, settled the bundle under her arm, and she looked at Wade one more time. Her expression hadn't changed, exactly. Still that same, measuring calm. But something in it had shifted, something very small and very quick that he didn't know how to name. She turned Rudy north into the broken country between the rock faces, and she rode. She rode the way she'd moved on foot, fast and precise and without any wasted motion at all. Wade watched her go for about 3 seconds. Then he turned around and walked to the fence and stood beside it with his arms folded and waited for the 3 riders to reach him. They pulled up in a cloud of dust, 3 men, rough-looking with horses that had been ridden hard. The one in front was broad across the shoulders, with a beard growing in wrong, and a pair of eyes that moved too fast, inventorying the scene. "Apache girl come through here," he said. Not a greeting, just a demand. Wade looked at him steadily. "Can't say I've seen anybody." The man looked at the fresh boot prints in the dust beside the fence. Looked at the hoof prints that showed a horse recently stopped and turned. Looked at Wade, who was standing at a fence line without a horse. "Those your tracks," the man said. "Some of them probably are," Wade said. The man's jaw worked. He looked at the ridgeline to the north where Nita and Rudy had disappeared into the juniper. He looked back at Wade with the expression of a man doing arithmetic he doesn't like the answer to. "Who sent you out here?" Wade said pleasantly. The man blinked. "What? Somebody sent you?" "Tracking a young Apache woman through the valley with 3 horses and a good head start. That's a paid job. I'm just wondering who's paying." The man's face tightened. He didn't answer. "That's fine," Wade said. "I was just curious." There was a long moment. The man looked once more at the north ridgeline. Then he looked at Wade in a way that was meant to communicate something. A warning, maybe, or just the shape of a threat that hadn't been spoken yet. Then he turned his horse, and the 3 of them rode south and didn't look back. Wade watched them until they were out of sight. Then he started walking west. It was about 4 miles back to the ranch house. He walked it in just under 2 hours in the July heat, which was not comfortable, and arrived at the gate sweated through and thirsty to find Burl standing in the yard holding a fence post and looking at him with an expression of deep and undisguised puzzlement. "Where's Rudy?" Burl said. "I lent him," Wade said. Burl waited for the rest of the sentence. "To somebody who needed him more than I did this morning," Wade said. Burl stood with the fence post for a moment, then he nodded very slowly and went back to work. Wade got himself a drink from the well and sat on the porch and thought about the woman's face when she'd taken the reins, the way she'd looked at him before she rode north. He couldn't read what that look had meant, and he found after a while that he wasn't sure he was supposed to be able to read it. The distance between where he was in his life and where she was in hers was not a distance that a few seconds of eye contact could cross. What he knew was simple. She had needed the horse. He had a horse to give. She had taken it. That was the whole of it. He told himself that, and mostly he believed it. The thing was, the horse was Rudy. Wade wasn't in the habit of admitting things like this, even to himself, but he had missed Rudy from the moment the woman rode north on him. Not just the loss of a good working horse, though that was real enough. He missed that particular animal, the specific weight and movement of him, the way Rudy's ears would rotate forward when something interesting was happening, the sound of his hooves on different ground. Clara used to say you could tell a lot about a man by which of his horses he favored, and she'd been right about most things. 4 days passed. Wade borrowed Solomon for the fence work and managed, and Burl did not bring up Rudy again. And the days went the way days go in a dry summer in the valley, full of small physical tasks and long hot silences and the distant sound of cattle on the north pasture in the early morning. On the evening of the 4th day, Wade was on the porch after supper when Burl came up from the barn at a pace slightly faster than his usual. He stood at the foot of the porch steps and looked northeast. "We've got company on the ridge," Burl said. Wade looked. The light was going orange and slant across the valley, and along the ridgeback to the northeast, there were shapes that hadn't been there an hour ago. He counted 7, then more. A line of riders along the crest, absolutely still, watching the ranch. He looked at Burl. "Apache, Chiricahua. By the cut of the horses," Burl said. Wade sat with that for a moment. He thought about going inside for his rifle. He decided against it. For the same reason he'd decided not to draw against those 3 riders on the trail 4 days ago. Reaching for a weapon when people are watching you from a distance is a message, and he didn't have enough information yet to know what message he wanted to send. "We wait," he said. They waited on the porch as the light went. The riders on the ridge didn't move. The dark came in from the east the way it does in that country, slowly at first and then all at once, and when it was full dark, Wade looked northeast, and the ridge was empty. He sat on the porch a while longer anyway, listening to the valley. Then he went to bed. At first light he went to the gate, and Rudy was standing there. The horse was in excellent condition, better condition, if Wade was being honest, than when he'd been given away. His coat had been brushed and combed, his hooves had been cleaned and freshly trimmed, and the worn left front shoe, the one that had been loose for 2 weeks and that Wade had been meaning to get to, had been reset, new and solid and level. Tied to the saddle horn was a bundle wrapped in cured deerskin. Wade untied it and opened it in the early light. Inside was a small piece of dried venison, a handful of roasted pinyon nuts, and a length of beadwork on a thin leather cord. The beadwork was blue and ivory white with a pattern that ran in small precise diamonds down the length of the cord. The work was intricate, the kind that takes time and attention and skill and a certain kind of quiet care about the result. Wade stood in the morning light holding it for a while. He put the venison and nuts in his coat pocket and carried the beadwork inside and set it on the table beside his coffee cup. He looked at it while he drank his coffee. He didn't know exactly what it meant in terms of language or custom, but he knew it meant something. The people who had returned his horse had brushed it and trimmed its hooves and fixed a shoe they hadn't broken and left food and a piece of careful handwork tied to the saddle. That was deliberate. Every part of it was deliberate. He picked up the beadwork and looked at the construction of it, the small tight stitches and the regularity of the pattern, and thought about a woman who had been running for her life and had still noticed a loose shoe. 2 mornings after that, a rider came in from the East Trail, approaching the ranch openly at a walk, a young Apache man maybe 20 years old, on a pinto with an easy seat. He stopped at the gate and looked at Wade, who was at the corral. "You are the man from the trail," he said. His English was deliberate and careful. "I am," Wade said. "My name is Doli," the young man said. "I was sent to speak with you." Wade opened the gate. They sat at the table in the ranch house, and Doli held his coffee cup the way anyone holds something hot on a cool morning. He looked at the beadwork on the table and said nothing about it. "The woman you helped on the trail," Doli said. "Her name is Nita. She is the daughter of our headman, Keto." He paused. "The men who followed her were hired by a man named Mace Darrow. He has been buying land in this valley for 3 years. He wants the corridor between your eastern fence and our summer gathering grounds. He needs both to control the only reliable water between the mountains and the valley floor." Wade was quiet for a moment. "I know the name," he said. He did. Darrow had come into the territory from somewhere back east with money and the particular manner of a man who believes that charm is a substitute for honesty. He had taken 3 ranches in 18 months, 2 of them from families that had been in the valley before Wade. The word from the families was vague and careful. They had decided to move on, they said. Nobody said exactly why. Wade had his suspicions. The only hard fact he knew was that a well on the old Dawes spread had been poisoned the previous spring, and the Dawes family had sold the week after. "Darrow sent those men to track Nita," Doli said. "She was returning alone from the eastern springs. She goes alone sometimes to gather materials. Our headman did not know she had gone." He paused. "She told us what happened on the trail, what you did." He met Wade's eyes. "She said you gave your horse without being asked, that you asked nothing in return." "That's about right," Wade said. "Our headman sends a message," Doli said. "He says the debt of the horse has been returned. But he says there is more." He set down his cup. "Darrow's men have been watching your ranch. The same men from the trail, and others. They have been on the South Ridge for 3 nights. They are not watching to learn your habits. They already know your habits. They are counting." Wade looked at him. "Our headman believes they will move against your land within a week. He has seen it before. Darrow does not threaten before he acts. He counts and then he moves." Wade stood and went to the window. He looked at his land in the morning light, the corral, the barn, the north pasture, the dry creek bed along the western edge. 15 years of work was in front of him. Not his 15 years he had been in the valley 11, but 15 years of accumulated labor from the man who broke this ground before him, and the 2 years of his own that he had poured in after. The fence posts, and the well lining, and the cleared pasture in the barn, with its new south roof and old north roof. Clara's kitchen garden, which he had kept going even after she was gone, because stopping it felt wrong. "There's more," Wade said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," Doli said. "Our headman also offers help." He paused, choosing the words. "The corridor Darrow wants, your land is the eastern anchor of it. If he takes your ranch, we lose access to the springs. What threatens you threatens us. Our headman says this: he knows you, and he are not the same. He knows the distance between your life and ours. But he says sometimes two people who are not the same are facing the same enemy." He met Wade's eyes again. "He says that is enough." Wade turned from the window. He looked at Doli for a long moment, reading the young man's face the way you read new country, not looking for what you want to find, but for what is actually there. What was there was straightforwardness. No calculation underneath it, no appeal to sentiment. Just a man at a table saying the true thing. "Tell Quito I want to meet," Wade said. Doli nodded once. He finished his coffee, set down the cup, and stood. At the door he stopped. "Nita also asked me to tell you something," he said. "She said to tell you your horse had a loose shoe on the left front. She noticed it on the trail. It has been reset." He paused. "She wanted you to know she noticed." He walked out to his horse and rode east at a walk, unhurried. Wade stood in the doorway and watched him go. He thought about a woman running through broken country at a dead run with her life on the line, and somehow still clocking a loose shoe on a borrowed horse. He went inside and looked at the beadwork on the table. He already knew one thing about Nita: she didn't miss much. The meeting with Quito happened the following morning at the old dry creek bed that marked Wade's eastern boundary. Wade rode out alone. Doli was there waiting, and beside him a man who could only be the headman, compact and deliberate on a gray horse, with silver threading through his hair, and a stillness about him that went all the way down. The kind of stillness that comes not from a quiet life, but from carrying a great weight over a long time, and learning not to let it show. Wade dismounted. Quito dismounted. They stood facing each other across 20 feet of pale cracked earth, and Doli stood between them and translated. Quito spoke. "He says you gave something freely to someone you did not know. He asks if you understood what it would cost you." Wade thought about that. "Not entirely," he said. "I knew it was a risk. I didn't know the shape of it yet." Doli translated. Quito listened and then spoke again. "He says, a man who does the right thing knowing it carries risk is worth more than a man who waits until the risk is gone. He says most men wait. He says the risk is never gone." "He's right about that," Wade said. Something shifted in Quito's face then. Very slight. A loosening, like ground that has been frozen and is beginning to consider something different. They spent the next hour at the dry creek bed. Quito laid out what he knew about Dargro's men, where they had been seen, what approach they would likely use, what targets they would hit first if their aim was to drive Wade out the way they had driven out others. He knew the terrain the way Wade knew his own barn. He knew where a man could lie still and be invisible from the trail, and where he couldn't. He knew which ridge could shelter horses and which could not. He knew the water sources and which ones Darrow would move on first. 'Cause water in that valley was not a resource, it was the whole conversation. Wade listened. He asked questions when he had them. Quito answered them fully, without the strategic withholding that Wade would have expected from any man in his position, any man with good reason to trust a stranger only so far, and who had just met this particular stranger 4 days ago in a transaction involving a horse. Wade found that after a while the openness of it asked something of him in return. He couldn't receive that kind of honesty and offer less than the same. He told Quito how many men he had, Burl only, and how much ammunition. He told him about the fence line on the south that had been weak for over a year. He told him he had no particular allies in town who would ride out on his behalf, because he had spent 11 years making sure he owed nobody anything, and what had seemed like independence now looked more like isolation. Quito listened. When Wade was done, he spoke briefly. He says, Doli translated, "You have been making yourself small so the world will leave you alone," he says. "Men like Darrow do not leave small things alone. He says the way to keep what is yours is sometimes to stand larger than you feel. Wade sat with that for a long moment. Tell him, he said at last, that I think he's right. Quito nodded. And after that, the conversation shifted from what they each faced to what they could do about it together, and it was the most useful conversation Wade Carver had engaged in since he came to this valley. Nita came to the ranch the following week. She rode up the main trail with Doli in the morning light, openly the way any visitor would. Wade was at the gate. She dismounted and stood looking at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything, and that was fine. They had been in a kind of conversation since that Thursday on the trail, an indirect conversation conducted through horses and beadwork and intermediaries and small significant details, and some of what needed to be said had already been said that way. She was even more striking in the plain morning light than she had been on the trail, high angular cheekbones, the same clear dark eyes that hadn't changed since the moment she'd decided to trust him enough to take the reins. She was wearing a different dress today, also finely made, with beadwork at the collar that matched the cord she'd left on his saddle. She was looking at him with a kind of directness that most people didn't manage, the kind that means someone is deciding whether you're worth taking seriously. The shoe held, she said. He blinked. The reset one, she said, and something at the corner of her mouth shifted just slightly. I was not entirely certain. I am better with baskets than with horses' feet. It held fine, Wade said. Better than the original. She looked past him at the ranch. She was reading it, he realized. Reading the details of how the place was kept, the way you read a person's character from what they choose to care about. He found he didn't mind being read. My father wants you to know, she said, bringing her eyes back to his, that what you did on the trail was not a common thing. Men have passed us in this valley for years without harm, but no man we did not know has given anything of his own. She paused. He says he is not a man who forgets debts, and he does not intend to forget this one. Tell your father he doesn't owe me anything, Wade said. I would have done it again. I know, she said, quiet, certain. They sat on the porch that morning, the three of them, with coffee and talked about the valley, about Darrow, and what might be done through proper channels. There was a territorial land office in Tucson that might want to know about a pattern of forged documents and pressured sales, about the land itself and what it needed. Nita knew things about the valley's water patterns that no amount of 11 years on a single piece of ground could have taught him. She knew where the springs were most reliable in dry years, and where they ran fast but shallow and couldn't be counted on after August. She talked about the mescal gathering that her band did each spring in the lower hills, and the coiled baskets they made from sotol leaves, and the roasting pits that had been in the same locations for generations. She talked about Yusin, the life-giver, not with ceremony, but with the matter-of-fact tone of someone mentioning something they trust to be true, the way you mention the sun coming up east. Wade listened. He asked questions. He didn't ask stupid ones, and she didn't condescend when he asked the real ones. There was a quality to the conversation that he hadn't felt in a long time. The specific pleasure of talking to someone who knows something you don't, and isn't holding it back from you. She came back the following Thursday, and the one after. Slowly, across those visits and the work that was happening around them, things changed. Not quickly and not all at once, but in the particular way that real change happens in a landscape. One thing at a time, quietly, until one day you look around and it's different. Darrow moved against the ranch on a moonless night, as Quito had predicted. Wade heard them before he saw them. The insects went quiet first, that particular absence of sound that isn't silence at all, but the creatures of the night recognizing that something large is moving in their territory and making themselves small. He was already at the barn door with Burl beside him when the first shape appeared on the south fence line. 8 riders, coming at a walk. No torches yet. Wade could make out the shapes of what they were carrying, cans, he thought, and the long silhouettes of rifles. They spread out as they approached the fence, moving into positions that told him they had studied the layout of this ranch carefully. What they hadn't studied was the layout as it stood tonight. Over the past 3 days, with Doli and 2 of Quito's men, Wade had shifted things in small but significant ways. The horses moved to the far north corral, the water tank on the south side protected and surrounded. Specific positions prepared behind the stone wall of the root cellar and along the east, fence, and on the ridges above, in places that Daro's men had no knowledge to account for, Chiricahua riders had been in position since before sundown, still and patient on the high ground, watching everything unfold below with the calm of people who have been doing this kind of work for more generations than Wade could count. He stepped out from the barn door into the open yard. He wasn't a theatrical man. What he felt in that moment wasn't drama. It was the specific clarity that comes when you've thought a problem through long enough that it stops frightening you, when you understand it well enough to act on it rather than just react to it. "I know who sent you," he said at a volume that carried across the dark yard. "I know his name. I know what he did to the Dawes family and the Henrys and the Cobbs before that. I know about the well." He paused. "I also know that right now there are people on both ridges above this ranch who have been watching your approach for the past hour. They know your positions and your numbers and what you're carrying and what you're here to do." A long silence. One of the riders spoke from the line. "You're bluffing." Wade looked up at the south ridge. He didn't have to do anything else. A small fire bloomed at the crest, controlled, brief, 4 seconds and gone. Then one from the north ridge, same. Then from the east a sound came down the hillside. Not a shout, a single clean note. The kind that carries meaning in it the way a word does, even when you don't speak the language. The horses began to move. Not in any organized way. Horses don't organize themselves at a moment like that. They shifted the way animals shift when they become suddenly aware that the ground they're standing on is not safe ground. And that awareness moved immediately into the men in the saddle, into their hands on the reins and the set of their backs. The man who had spoken said something quiet to the men around him. Wade didn't catch the words. He didn't need to. They turned their horses and rode south. Not fast enough to be called running, and not dignified enough to be called anything else. They just left. Wade stood in the yard and watched them until the dark swallowed them. Burl exhaled beside him. Then Wade went inside and made coffee because it was past midnight, and he wasn't going to sleep, and he wasn't tired in any way that sleep addressed. He sat at the table and looked at Nita's beadwork, which was still where he had set it the first morning. He thought about Mace Darrow, who was a problem that had not been solved tonight, only pushed back. Men like Darrow didn't fold up from a single reversal. They had lawyers and territory officials, and the particular resilience of people who have money where their principles should be. Tonight had changed the arithmetic. It hadn't changed the man. But it was a different kind of problem now, the kind you work on over time with other people instead of the kind that works on you alone. Nita came to the ranch the morning after, not with Doli this time. She came alone, riding up the main trail in the early light. Wade was at the gate. She dismounted and stood looking at him. She had been there that night, he knew, or somewhere nearby. She had been on the ridge. He didn't say that, and she didn't confirm it, but it was understood between them the way certain things get understood without being said. "You didn't sleep," she said. "No," he said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with those level eyes. "Neither did I," she said. There was something different in the air that morning. Not that things had changed between them all at once. That's not how it works with people who are careful and honest, and have both been hurt by the world in ways that make them cautious. But a door had opened somewhere, a door that neither of them had quite acknowledged was there before. He said, "Come in. I'll put on coffee." She came in. They sat at the table, and she saw the beadwork where it had been sitting since the first day. She didn't say anything about it for a while. Then she said, "You kept it." "Of course," he said. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at him. "My grandmother made pieces like this one," she said. "She said the pattern holds a story. You read it from left to right, the same as water flows." She touched it lightly with one finger. "This pattern means something returning to where it started but different. She used to say everything true makes that shape." Wade looked at the beadwork, then at her. "That's a good thing to know," he said. She nodded, and the look on her face in that moment was not soft exactly. Nita was not a soft person, and that was one of the things he had already come to understand about her. But it was open. The look of someone who has found, almost by accident, a place where they don't have to hold everything back. Over the weeks that followed, the valley changed slowly and in small ways. A waterline managed differently between Wade's eastern boundary and the spring where Keto's band gathered in summer. A trail that crossed both their territories used freely instead of avoided. A gate left open in the evenings. An invitation that didn't need to be spoken. Mace Darrow was removed from the picture eventually. Not quickly or cleanly. And that story belongs to another telling. It involved a land surveyor from the territory office. A set of deeds that turned out to be fraudulent. And a particular winter when 3 families that Darrow had pressured over the previous 2 years, each decided in the same month to stop staying quiet. The territory court moved slowly, but it moved. That was months away. In the meantime, there was the valley and the work and the slow, careful, honest business of 2 people getting to know each other across a distance that required patience and respect to cross. Nita taught Wade things about the land he was living on that 11 years of working it had not taught him. Which plants held water in a dry year. How to read the light on the dragoons in the morning to know what the afternoon would bring. The locations of the old Chiricahua camps up in the mountain folds where the air was cooler and the springs never ran dry. Places her band had been going for longer than anyone living could remember. She told him about gathering agave at the right moment in spring, roasting the hearts in great pit fires that burned for days, the sweetness of the cooked flesh that lasted all winter. She talked about her uncle who had been a respected man among the Chiricahua, a healer, who had been killed by Darrow's men the month before she ran into Wade on that trail. She talked about it once, plainly and without theatrics, and Wade listened the same way, and after she was done they sat quietly for a while, which was the right thing to do. He told her about Clara. He hadn't talked about Clara to anyone in 2 years. He told her about the fever, and about the garden, and about the specific silence that had settled into the ranch house after, the kind of silence that is not peaceful but hollow. He told her about giving himself so completely to the work that he'd stopped noticing the silence, and how it had crept back in every evening all the same. Nita listened. She didn't offer comfort of the obvious kind. What she offered was attention, and it was worth more. "My mother says," she told him once, "that grief is not a thing you carry through and set down. She says it is something you carry while you build other things, until the other things are large enough that the grief finds its right proportion." He thought about that for a long time. There were evenings in the autumn when Nita stayed late, and the fire in the yard burned low and they sat beside it with their coffee, talking or not talking, in the easy way that develops between people who have spent enough time together that the silence is comfortable. More than comfortable. The silence had stopped feeling empty. He noticed her hands one evening, the precision of them. She was working a small piece of weaving, demonstrating a stitch she was trying to describe, and he watched how her fingers moved over the materials with the unhurried certainty of deep knowledge. "How long did it take you to learn that?" he asked. She thought about it. "I am still learning," she said. "My grandmother says you learn the whole pattern over a whole life. Each piece you make teaches you something the last one didn't." He thought that was the truest thing he had heard in a long time. One evening in late October, when the air had gone cool, and the cottonwoods along the creek were turning yellow, and the dragoons to the east were going blue in the last of the light, Wade asked her something he had been thinking about for a while. He asked it plainly, without ceremony, the way he did most things. He said, "I know your life is not here. I know your people are here, and the mountains, and everything that means something to you is here in a way that has nothing to do with me. But I'd like you to have the option of this place too, if you ever wanted it." She looked at him for a long time. The fire had burned down to coals, and the light from it was warm and quiet. "What are you asking?" she said. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to be my wife," he said. "I'm not asking you to leave your life. I'm asking if you'd be willing to build something alongside it." He paused. "I'm not in a hurry for an answer." She was quiet for a while. The coals shifted and sent up a small flutter of sparks. "I told my father," she said at last, "that the man on the trail did not have the look of a man who expects something in return for what he gives." She looked at Wade. He said, "Then how do you know what he wants?" "And I told him I didn't yet, that I was going to find out." "Did you?" Wade said. She looked at him steadily, not with softness, not with drama, with the same clear measuring attention she'd fixed on him the first moment on the trail when she was deciding whether or not to trust him. "Yes," she said. She reached across and set her hand on his. The fire had gone to embers and the stars had come out over the dragoons, and for a long moment neither of them said anything, And it wasn't the hollow silence of a man living alone in a house that's too quiet. It was the other kind, the kind you have to earn. That was the autumn of 1884, in the Sulphur Springs Valley east of the Dragoon Mountains, in that wide, dry country where the sky is so large it makes everything underneath it seem both very small and very consequential at the same time. Wade Carver had come to that valley 11 years earlier, looking for land and work, and the particular peace that comes from isolation. He had found the land and the work. The peace had come later, and not from isolation at all. It came from a Thursday morning in July when he had stopped on a trail and looked at a woman running and made a choice so fast he hadn't had time to second-guess it. The right choice, it turned out. The kind you don't get to make very often, and the kind that changes the shape of everything that follows. His horse came back to him fixed and brushed and better cared for than he'd sent it. And along with the horse came something he hadn't been expecting, the opening of a world that had been right beside his own all along, visible from his front porch on any clear morning, full of knowledge and care, and the long accumulated wisdom of people who had been living in this land since long before he or anyone he knew had arrived in it. He had handed his horse to a stranger on a trail and gotten back more than he had. Words for Nita would say later, years later, sitting on that same porch, the garden grown fuller now and tended by two sets of hands, that the first thing she had thought when she saw him swing down from that saddle was that he must not know what he was doing. That no man in his right mind gives away his best horse to someone he doesn't know in open country with riders coming on. And then she had watched his face as he held out the reins. He knew exactly what he was doing, she would say. And he did it anyway. That was the whole of it. And that, she would tell you, is the only kind of person worth building a life with. The kind who sees what something costs and does the right thing regardless. If this story spoke to you, if it reminded you that a single act of real generosity can open a door you didn't know was there, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments, would you have given the horse? We read every single one.